I knew from a very young age that FGM was something that was wrong. When my cutter walked into the house that we were in Djibouti, I knew that there wasn't anything good that was going to come out of that. People deem women not to be able to have control over their bodies. Would you want this to happen to you? No. Would you want this to happen to girls in your family? No. Then we need to do something about it. Hello, I'm Nimco Ali, and I'm one of the 230 million women who is a survivor of FGM. I had FGM when I was 7, which involves partial or total removal of the female anatomy for non-medical reasoning. We were in Somaliland from when I was like 6 years old on holiday. Then the civil war broke out, and we went from Somaliland, Hargeisa, which is the capital of Somaliland, to Djibouti. And just before we came back to the UK, that's when I had my FGM. I had no visual understanding or any concept of what the consequences of what that woman would do would be. But I could kind of understand that this was something that was being planned and something that was going to happen. So I did have some anesthesia in order to kind of numb the anatomy in order for it to be as painful. There are different categories of FGM. There are, it's 4 types. Type 3 is the most invasive form of FGM, and that's the form of FGM that I had. But I would never classify any FGM as being worse than the other. I think the actual act of FGM is what's terrible. I knew from a very young age that FGM was something that was wrong. So when I say that I was a very vocal child, it wasn't something that really made me so scared I wasn't able to talk about it. It actually made me want to be able to ask more questions. I was very explicit and told my teacher at the time what had happened to me, and I can still see the look on her face because she was taken aback having this 7-year-old that was coming back into your class completely different with such a vivid explanation of this horrific act that had happened to her. I was seeking answers. So when I went to my teacher and asked her, what is this? It's like, what is this thing that happened to me? And very explicitly, talked about it. And she looked at me in complete utter shock and couldn't give me an answer which she thought was, I think, fitting for a 7-year-old. And secondly, that wasn't gonna undermine what she thought was part of my culture, which it wasn't. The aftermath of the FGM for me, it wasn't necessarily painful. I was just angry. And I think that is something that I took with me into my adolescence and something that I had to kind of come to terms with. I was incredibly angry with the people around me who I trusted. I was incredibly angry with the woman or the person that carried out my FGM. And when I came back to the UK, I was incredibly angry with the people that were around me in a wider kind of context, be they teachers or social services, or all these other kind of people, in the fact that they were trying to minimize the experience that I had. I didn't necessarily recover until I had medical intervention. I was very close to kidney failure when I was 11. So that's when I was rushed into hospital to have what was called a defibrillation. I developed an eating disorder when I was 14. I think that was again another coping mechanism, and I think that's another way of physically trying to control your body and all those other kind of things. But I think it also made me a little bit less trusting of the world. The issue about FGM is that my FGM happened really out of context. And this is one of the things that I say, which people don't understand when I say that my mum and my grandmother were incredible feminists, and they were women who championed me throughout my life. But then someone said to me, but you had FGM. They had no control over that. They had control over the way that I was raised prior to my FGM and after my FGM. So I was allowed to be who I was. And for me to be as vocal and as argumentative and also as single-mindedly stubborn as I was as a child, as a female, as a girl child, I think that's a testament to the women that were around me. So that trust was necessarily, it was broken and it wasn't fully healed, but when it really healed was that when I could see that I was in a position that no other woman in my family had ever been in. I had FGM, but I was freely educated. I was able to do whatever I was able to do, wanted to do. I was able to control my destiny. And many of the women in my family weren't able to do that because they had to get married, they had children. They were still within a cultural context. which meant I had those choices, and the next generation in my family is so free from FGM that it's just 3 random letters that they will never know anything about. And I think that's testament to the women that came before me, and ultimately the kind of power that they gave me to be who I was. So I think that trust came back, and that trust in myself to believe in what I am saying came from the people who had kind of semi-failed me, but I don't think necessarily had the power to do as much as I thought they could do. There are 230 million women globally. Most of those women are in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are also women in the UK that are living with the consequences of female genital mutilation. Like any other form of violence against women and girls, the reason why it persists and the reason why it happens is it's just due to gender inequality. I think that there is a lot of cultural relativism, and a lot of people that want to excuse women who partake in FGM, or actually the cutters themselves, as people that are doing it through means to make money and so on. That might be true in certain communities, but I know it wasn't true specifically for the woman who ended up carrying out my FGM. And I think it was in 2017 I ended up meeting a cutter for the first time since I had FGM. And I remember this woman really making the excuse of saying that she needs to feed her kids in order to carry out the FGM. And I asked her, did she cut her own children? And she said yes. And then I asked her, did she cut her grandchildren? She said yes. And I said, who was paying you to do that? Obviously, nobody was paying her to do that. So I think there's a cycle of abuse which people who are victims and survivors themselves, in order to normalize it, take part. And cutters take an incredible role in that. So that's just an explanation to say that when my cutter walked into the house that we were in Djibouti, I knew that there wasn't anything good that was going to come out of that. As much as a physical act, it has a psychological and emotional impact on you. I don't necessarily think I came to terms with my FGM until I was in my late 20s, through the activism that I did, and really realizing that I was beyond FGM, and it wasn't something. It was something that happened to me, and something that doesn't define me. And I'm not saying that, other survivors. Every survivor has her journey. That was my journey. So ultimately, FGM was meant to break me, and then the male patriarchal context was meant to shape me into the woman that I should be, and the woman that was deserving of the man who I should have married. But ultimately, FGM did the complete opposite to me. It made me the loudest person in the room. I think it kind of unleashed this anger of the why, and then in that search for the why, I really unpicked this thread of control that was hanging over Somali women and most other women across the world who have to deal with FGM. So there is no medical kind of context into it, but the reality is, and the sad reality is, that because we've always talked about the medical consequences and the physicalities of FGM, that we've really forgotten about the human rights impact of it. So many countries like Egypt, for example, have started to medicalize FGM, have started to put it in a hospital and a more clinical context. But that doesn't make it any safer, and it doesn't make it any more right, because this is still a form of abuse that's happening because people deem women not to be able to have control over their bodies. FGM is a global issue. There is not one place in the world that you can say that there are women that live without the consequences of FGM. But when the global average age of FGM is 5, and when women are able to live into their 80s, I think that could be up to the 300 million women that could be living with FGM globally. My need to step into this conversation didn't come from a position of me thinking I want to end FGM. It was first of all, it was driven by guilt. It was driven by guilt that there was this misconception that that FGM was this loving act. It wasn't. It was a form of violence. And it was also driven by the anger that I had that, there was so many girls that were being let down. The reality is we need to look at FGM like any other form of abuse. We need to give women grace, and we need to give survivors compassion. But we also have to stand steadfast and say that it's just unacceptable. You don't need to understand the ins and outs of FGM to know it's wrong. You don't need to know what kind of experiences someone had in order for it to know it's wrong. And you don't actually have to put a cultural context into it. It's just to ask yourself the simple question, would you want this to happen to you? No. Would you want this to happen to girls in your family? No. then we need to do something about it. So I've been in this space, trying to help end FGM for almost a decade. Things are changing in the way that women are able to speak about their experiences. Secondly, I think we've been incredibly successful in the country to help pass legislation that's going to protect girls. I think the number of girls at risk of FGM in this country has reduced, but the risk factor is still there. There are still women that are coming into this country who have consequences of FGM. In order for FGM to change, there are two things, and there's one here in the UK, which is ultimately about us stop thinking about FGM as a cultural issue. It's a form of violence against women and girls. And then secondly, the major one, in order for us to make an incredible dent on the global stats on FGM, is to invest in African women. So we set up the FIVE Foundation in order just to give 100% of all the money that we raise to African women. So it would be incredible for anybody that can kind of support us to go to our website to support the FIVE Foundation and really get to know the incredible women who are on the front line of ending FGM. I've been incredibly privileged to live in the West. I have safety, I've had healthcare, I've had education, and that is the reason why I'm able to be who I am today. And it's we need to be able to give those opportunities to other women on the African continent. And I look at my niece and my little cousins who are 13 and 15 and so far removed from any of the experiences that I had. But they shouldn't be lucky ones, they shouldn't be the odd ones out. That should be the norm for every single girl in this country and on the African continent. And that's the only way that we can end FGM.